Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriska here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of July 8th through July 14th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these Russian Ukrainian weekly updates, be sure to subscribe to this channel. So, and this week we have a lot of updates. The Russian summer offensive across basically almost the entire front continues, and let us go with the updates. So first we're going to start in the Donetsk direction, and soon we might be calling this the Pokrovsk direction, as a lot of people have been saying, because the Russians are getting closer and closer to the city of Pokrovsk. But I don't think I should call it that just yet, because I don't think the Russians are going to continue pushing towards Pokrovsk. I think I've explained this in my other videos, but I think once the Russians have cleared up the eastern bank of the Volga River, I think they're going to start focusing more on this direction, towards Konstantinivka, in order to help the forces in Torets to encircle that city. I don't think the Russians are going to continue pushing towards Pokrovsk itself at this time, I should say. But let's go on what they have achieved this week. So first, the main focus of this has been Novoselivka-Pershi. This is basically one of the last, or actually the last major Ukrainian defense city, town, well not city, but town that is on the eastern side of the Volga River. This is the last thing the Russians need to capture before they could basically have a free hand on reaching the Volga River, which for my estimations, is what the Russian goal is in this direction. And this week we have a ton of progress from the Ukrainians. Now, last week the Russians took the village of Voskok here, and because the defenses here crumbled, the Ukrainians are like, well, why would we want to defend, this tree line, and this area right here to the south of Voskok, because it's like there's literally no way to help support this area because there's a river between them. So they fell back to Zelenia and the defenses in front of it, but this let the Russians capture all these tree lines to the south of Voskok. And because they were able to take Voskok and take these tree lines to the north of Novoselivka-Pershi, the Ukrainians that were defending, they had a bit of a stronghold here. You could see the stronghold here. This is kind of like the stronghold of Novoselivka-Pershi, like the equivalent of what we saw in Sokol. However, because the Russians were on the eastern side after they took Novopokrovsk last month, and now that they're on the northern side, they were able to squeeze the Ukrainians out and start assaulting Novoselivka-Pershi from the north. And this week what we got is that the Russians have taken the farms, basically, these farms to the north of Novoselivka-Pershi, and they also have captured this education center, the schoolhouse in Novoselivka-Pershi in the north. And these are strong, these are very fortified buildings because everything else is one-story houses. So the capture of these is a very big deal. Some sources are actually saying that the Russians have basically already captured everything up to this road already, which wouldn't surprise me. And that the only thing that's actually helping the Ukrainians is kind of like this forest that separates kind of Ukrainian defenses in the south here from the north. But it's safe to say that northern Novoselivka-Pershi has been captured by the Russians. Not only that, we saw geolocated confirmation that the Russians are on the eastern outskirts of Novoselivka-Pershi. We saw them capture these warehouses to the east here. The Ukrainians are joining their positions here. And some pro-Russian sources are saying they have also captured up to kind of like this area right here as well. So this area has been cleared by the Russians. And so the battle for Novoselivka-Pershi has begun. But based on the progress the Russians have done, I wouldn't be surprised if, because this road is already, the Ukrainians can't use this road. Look how close the Russians are. The only road the Ukrainians have is to use this road right here. Now, thankfully for the Ukrainians, the Russians have not been able to have as much progress in the south of Novoselivka-Pershi as in the north and east. So they're able to use this road that leads them to Komishya and such like that. But, again, the Russians are close. They can still target them with drones and artillery fire, but it's not physically or, in a direct line of sight, I should say. I wouldn't be so the battle of Novoselivka-Pershi has begun. The Russians are on the eastern outskirts of the town. They are in the north, and I wouldn't be surprised that by the end of next week, I would expect Novoselivka-Pershi to fall. And once Novoselivka-Pershi falls, I am betting you that probably the Russians will use the rest of July to mop up and make the front line go along the Vochka River. So Mezovia and Shuski, these aren't really towns. These are kind of things that are supposedly towns, but if you like zoom in, there's like nothing there. Like let's zoom in to Sushki, for example. Like there's like fucking like two houses. So like, these aren't like towns, but like there's like a building there, so they named a city out of it for some reason. But yeah, Novosibirsk Persia is falling. I by the end of next week, it probably will fall, and the Russians will probably by the end of July have the front line go something like this. So yeah, that is the Novosibirsk Persia is was the last thing the Ukrainians wanted to lose, because this is holding this town was what allowed Ukrainians to continue holding the Russians back from the Vochka River. But now that it's being stormed, the time is numbered. Yes, no. There's been no changes in the southern direction. There's still some sources trying to determine what exactly the configuration of this area is. Some sources are saying Yasnobrodka has been captured. Some say this is in the gray zone. Right now, we don't. So the configuration of we know for sure the Ukrainians are behind this red line. We know for certain that but are the Ukrainians still having positions in these like kind of dachas in on this side? We don't know where exactly. So we're still trying to wait for confirmation how to. But what we do know is that I think we saw geolocated footage of Russian troops being in Yasnobronovka, but so we're still trying to figure out how the southern section of this is playing out. There's been some changes up in the north here as well. The Russians are also this week took the center of the village Yedinivka here. They basically took this part of the town. This was the center of the village. Now this is a elongated village. This is a village that's pretty dang long. I think so, because if I believe correctly, that this village extends all the way down here and reaches here as well. And the Russians haven't taken this area right here yet. So I don't think the entire village technically has been captured, but the center and the most of 75% of it has been captured. And so the center of Yevgenivka has been captured. Along with this, the Russians have continued their advancement towards the village of Porez, which is another goal of the Russians here. Once, they'll reach the Vochka River, but in order to secure their flanks in the Vochka River, they need to take these two towns right here. And so the next, after Novosibirsk Persia falls, the next spot that the Russians will focus on is the village of Porez. But in order to do that, they have to continuously try to encircle it. And right now, they're going to try to get closer and closer to the eastern outskirts of it, but also to the south. In order to do that, they needed to take Yevgenivka, and they have. And now that they've captured these two tree lines as well with it, the Russians can continue advancing along, this river, and continuously, they're going to try to take this tree line right here. The Russians will try to take this tree line right here and this tree line. And so they'll continue advancing until they reach kind of like where there's it's not necessarily as thick of a river, but you could still see some water barriers here. So the Russians will try to reach this area right here and, take this, and then this will start putting pressure on the southern part of Porez. So the village of Yevgenivka has fallen, basically. Along with this, however, the Russians also want to put the squeeze from the north of Porez. And what we saw this week is that after the Russians have secured Nova Alexandrivka, they have now continued their advance towards the village of Laskovka here. And so the Russians have reached the outskirts of this village. It's one of those villages, again, that are called a village, but when you look down, there's nothing here. Yeah, there's legitimately jack shit here. I don't know why there's a town here. But anyway, they say that whatever this village is, the Russians are apparently trying to reach it here and kind of take it and reach here, and this will help secure the flanks as the Russians continue their assault on Vozdozhenivka here. Taking this village is actually very important because this is the last village between the Russians and the Konstantinivka-Pokrovsk highway, which the Russians want to cut. But, again, you can see now that they've and we actually had some progress this week. We got some confirmation that the Russians have taken this area right here this week. So they've, advanced here. And I think the main Ukrainian defense line, they have a stronghold that's right here. So Obviously, as the Russians try to advance along this road, they'll have to storm this somehow. But again, as they reach this village, they're going to start being more exposed on the flanks here, because the Ukrainians are still up in the north here and they're still in the south. So I'm betting that the Russians will try to focus on the south, clear this village, and probably start advancing towards Timnovka, and probably try to take this village as well, because this serves double purpose. Not only does this secure the southern flank of the Russians advancing towards this village, this was one of the main goals. It also helps secure and starts putting the pressure on the north of Pokrovsk, which is another goal of the Russians. So right now, after Novoselivka Pershi falls and the Russians finish clearing up, the places where the Russians will continue focusing is to take this village and this village. In order to take, this is why I think this axis of attack to take these two little villages right here is going to be where the Russians are going to put a lot of their efforts, because then this helps secure the flanks and starts undermining the defenses of this village and this village, which is what the Ukrainians want to hold on to as much as possible. So the Russians are making progress. They also, in the north of Nova Alexandrivka, some sources are saying that they've captured this tree line right here, and they basically have continued trying to secure their Nova Alexandrivka flanks. The Donetsk direction is very lucrative for the Russians, and the Russians are making steady progress in this direction. So we shall see how the Russians continue advancing on their goals for the rest of July. We're now going to go to the South Donetsk direction. We're going to begin in the town of Sorry, I hiccuped. In the town of Krasnogorivka. We actually have a lot of big news for this week. So this week, Krasnogorivka has sealed its fate. Now, I talked about how the fall of the refractory plant was basically the doom of Krasnogorivka, and it was, because after that plant, the Russians made continuously attacks on Krasnogorivka, but we never saw them actually secure themselves because they got pushed back. What we did see is that once the Russians did take the plant, the Ukrainians weren't able to push the Russians out of Krasnogorivka any longer. But there were still some positions in Krasnogorivka that the Ukrainians could use to hold back the Russians. However, those places have fallen. And what I mean by that is these high-rise building areas and this hospital. This was holding back the Russians from being able to continuously advance beyond, these were holding the Russians back, and these were like kind of the main strongholds from the 2014 defense line. There was these trenches, but then there was also, further back there was these high-rise buildings and this hospital. And so we got confirmation that because of Russian pressure in the behind them, the Russians were advancing up here, and they were in the north. They were trying to advance and capture this area right here. Because of the threat of encirclement, the Ukrainians gave up these and retreated back towards this area, more towards like the north of this park. So the main strongholds that the Ukrainians were using to slow down the Russians in Krasnogorivka has fallen. We also got confirmation that we got sources saying that the Russians have taken the sports hall, like the gymnastics gym area of Krasnogorivka. This area, taking this will allow the Russians to advance onto the park. The Russians are still making slow and steady progress on the western residential area, but because of with the fall of this, the Krasnogorivka is now sealed. The Russians will probably take everything here, and now it's just a slow battle of clearing every house here and making sure the residential area is cleared. One thing that is notable here is that, Krasnogorivka is falling, but the Ukrainians still have positions on, in these fields right here. And so they're actually launching counterattacks and trying to, so the Russians have to keep putting troops in these areas here as they could, because, so this might be why it's actually taken a bit longer to secure the northwest part of Krasnogorivka, because, the Russians have to put troops in these farms. They have to put troops in these residential areas in the south, because this will be, if they don't, then they risk getting attacked by and cut. At least their supplies being cut. So this actually might be why the northwestern residential areas might be a bit harder to take. I actually expect that before the Russians focus on this area of Krasnogorivka, they might start trying to advance towards the fields and create a better buffer zone, or at the very least clear out this Ukrainian stronghold and have the positions be right here, and so they could start pushing the Ukrainians and threatening their flanks. But right now, the Russians still have to secure their positions in Grigorivka before they could start easing the pressure on the Russian troops in Krasnogorivka. One of the major there's been no changes on the Ugledar section this week. However, we got a very big change in the Velika Novoselivka area. And this week we saw the full capture of the village of Urozhaine. This was a big deal. We got geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flag in the center, and then also in the north here. We saw the Russian troops raising their flags in the north and the center. This was pretty big. I was expecting a bit of a longer battle here because before this week the Russians were just in the southern outskirts of Urozhaine, but it seems like they did some sort of big offensive. And sorry, just drinking some water. Anyway, after they did some sort of big offensive this week, which led to the full capture of Urozhaine. So we got to look at footage of that. We have, and this was the capture of Staromorsk and Urozhaine during the Russian summer offensive here is pretty solid gains. This has basically forced the Ukrainians to keep their reserves in this section of the front line. They couldn't put them anywhere else. Now the big question is if the Russians will continue because Staromorsk and Urozhaine are two fine goals. This will force the Ukraine. These are two pretty solid towns. Everything else is pretty small up until Velika Novoselivka. But one thing to say though is that now it's just a question of what is the Russian commander's goal here, because now to advance towards Makharovka, they're going to have to start securing their flanks. It's going to be a whole other process, because Urozhaine fell because Staromorsk fell, as you remember. In order to take Staromorsk, they had to clear the trenches to the north of Priyutia. So this was a this took a lot of time to take these two villages, and now they have to restart that kind of progress to help, as they reverse the Ukrainian gains in the summer offensive. So I could see it in the Russian interest to continue their offensive here, because if they stop, then the Ukrainians are like, okay, now we could divert troops from Velika Novoselivka and put them in a place that's more critical or something. But I don't know where the Russians might attack. Maybe they continue advancing, try to take Makharovka. Maybe they try to advance towards Rovnopol. So it just depends on how the Russians want to play this. So I don't know. But this was a good first step. This was, but I still think that the purpose of this axis here is not necessarily to capture anything. I don't think the Russians are planning on taking, it's not like the goal is to take Velika Novoselivka. But what they will try to do is keep Ukrainian troops here. So they have to continue doing at least small scale attacks here. There's been no changes in the Kherson and Zaporozhye directions. Let's go to the Toretsk direction. This is where a lot of the fun stuff is, this month of July and all that. This is where a lot of gains have been happening. So, man, it's kind of funny how, for the last, 2.5 years, this direction's been literally quiet. There's been jack shit happening here. And then suddenly this is, one of the most active parts of the front line. Let's talk about New York, though. So this week we have a lot of progress in the Russians from New York. One thing that we've got, what happened here is that apparently the Russians were able to advance deep into towards the outskirts of the center of New York and capture the southern part of it, this entire area, because they were able to undermine the Ukrainians and get behind their lines. And because of that, the Ukrainians fell back to the center of New York. And however, this led to the dangerous thing of the Ukrainians that are in these villages trying to outflank, attack the flanks of this. And so the Russians this week have also improved the flanks of New York, of their gains in New York. They have captured these two tree lines to the south of Urozhaine here to help secure their gains in this village. They have taken, these gains right here. And so they didn't just take, the residential areas itself. They're now taking the western tree lines to help secure their gains a bit better, and and have a buffer zone between Ukrainian positions in these villages, which were meant to support, to prevent the Russians from taking New York from the west here. But now that New York is basically being stormed from the east, they have to. The Russians have to keep distance between the Ukrainian positions here and in New York. So they're improving the flanking positions of this area. The Russians also made some more gains. They're trying to reach this river. So New York is split by this small river right here, and the Russians are trying to reach it. They took these two streets this week, so the Russians are continuously still moving along this residential area and trying to reach this river. One of the biggest reports that we got this week is that the Russians have stormed and have captured. I forgot the name of this area that they call in New York, but they have captured these high-rise buildings. This is a huge deal. Like, I think this was another. If this is true, then this is another example apparently of the Russians somehow getting around Ukrainian position, or maybe the Ukrainians didn't build as much fortifications here because they were expecting they had all their fortifications in the south here, where the front line has been for like 2 years. So I think they just weren't prepared for a Russian assault on this area. Now, it's not 100% geolocated, but a lot of sources are saying this is true, and Syriac, which is a neutral source, says this is also happening. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, have taken the rest of this residential area as well. And now the last thing that the Ukrainians basically have is this factory of New York right here. This is the last main defense node of New York. But I mean, if this falls, then so this was something that was supposed to hold the Russians back from the western part of New York, but this has been captured. So I mean, this is a big deal. The capture of this fortification area is a big deal for the Russians. It seems like the defenses of New York are a lot weaker than expected. So we shall see if the I expect next week that the Russians will continue trying to clear the residential area to the south of this river, and they're going to continue trying to improve their positions in this area right here as well. So the front line will actually kind of go probably along this river, and then we shall see what the Russians will do once they reach that river. So yeah, but also the Russians are making some steady progress in the Tourette's direction as well. We saw some geolocated footage of the Russians have now started the battle for Zalishnia. This is another town that's on the outskirts of Touretsk. We saw the Russians manage to capture these streets right here, and so. Now the battle for this village is ongoing. Because of this, I'm almost certain now that basically that this Terrakon right here, which is one of the main Ukrainian defenses, has probably fallen if the Russians are behind it and right on the outskirts of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if this Terrakon has fallen as well, but we don't have geolocated footage of that. The battles are still ongoing for these high-rise buildings right here. So there's been no changes in terms of who controls what. I think we went over last week how the Russians are. We saw them capture this high-rise building right here, or at least it was getting shelled by Ukrainian forces. Let's see. Yeah, there's been so the main changes have been in the south here. The Russians are still trying to clear these residential areas in the eastern part of Druzhba. They're still trying to clear this residential area to the south of Penichnia to try to secure the northern defense as they try to capture the stronghold. So yeah, but the main show of this week in the Tourette's direction is now that they've entered Zalishnia as well. So the Russians are making a lot of progress in the Tourette's direction, and we shall see if they continue trying to improve their positioning in these three towns that protect Touretsk. In the Chasiv Yar direction, there's actually only been some. It looks like the Russians are taking an operational pause. We saw that the Russians have increased their bombardments of central Chasiv Yar, so now that they're the focus of the artillery and bombings and everything. Let's see here. He's what do you say? Yeah, they are putting the focus of their bombings in the center of Chasiv Yar, destroying Ukrainian defenses here. But there's been no assaults on this town. Looks like they're trying to just consolidate their positions here. They're still trying to battle for Kalinova. We still don't know the exact positioning of the front line in Kalinova. So we have to see. We still need to get some footage out of this to see where the front line really is in Kalinova. So yeah. Let's see here. But the one thing we did get is that the western part of Klishevka it looks like Klishevka is under Russian control. We got geolocated footage of the Ukrainians bombing Russians in this forest right here. So it looks like Klishevka is still under Russian control. Some sources are saying that it was in a gray zone, but it looks like it's still actually under Russian control. And we also had geolocated footage of the Russians in Andriivka as well. So these two towns have been pretty much recaptured, and it looks like we got that confirmation a while ago, but like a month ago, I think, or something. But we actually just got the we have confirmation this week that the Russians are still in control of this. I do think that the Russians will probably try to focus on, maybe instead of assaulting Chasiv Yar directly, probably trying to clear this bank of the canal, maybe. But yeah, we shall see. There's been no real changes in the Severus direction. Looks like the Russians have basically just been improving the flank, their positioning around Rozdolivka after the capture of that village, and so yeah. But there's been no really big changes in the Severus direction. In the Laman direction, the Azov battalion, who is in the Kremenaya forest right here, have taken a small part of the forest in this area right here. And it looks like, while this is not like something that's critical for the Russians, it is still they're still gaining a lot in this direction. And, this, this will threaten Russian positions in Dubrova and such like that as they try to outflank it. But one thing it does help is help secure Ukrainian positions in Grigorivka and Syerbrenka right here. Because if the Russians want to continue assaulting from Bilogorivka, which was captured, then they would have had to capture these forests, but the Azov battalion is preventing that. So they're making, the Ukrainians are actually probably their most successful front is in Liman, because at the very least they have prevented almost any Russian gains in that direction. In the Kupiansk direction, we actually have some one of the major changes we actually have is that the Russians are in the village of Makivka right here. We actually got geolocated footage of the Ukrainians bombing Russians in Makivka, and they have captured the center of the town. Now, the entire village has not been taken. I think this village is actually split in two by the Zhirobets River, and so this is going to be a hard nut to crack, because I don't think the Russians are going to try to cross this river. They can't. I don't think they'll be able to capture this thing right now, but I do think the Russians will continue, I do think the Russians will probably try to clear the Makivka farms to the south here, and so the Russians will probably continuously try to capture this area. But yeah, the center of Makivka has fallen, and the capture of this basically allows the Russians to, or at least gives the Russians the chance to start outflanking the village of Nevsky, which the Ukrainians have held the Russians back with their defenses in the fields here, but if the Russians have taken Makivka, that might, the Russians might be able to go down along the river using the river as defense and start, threatening Nevsky. So, taking Makivka is a good job for the Russians, but what's important about of capturing the center of this village is that it starts threatening the flanks of Nevsky. So we shall see if the Russians, develop on their offensive here. The Russians are still battling for Stimatovka here. The village has not been fully taken. They say that the Russians have entered the village and have taken everything to the east of the Zhirobets River here. So they've taken like the houses that are along this road. Yeah. So it's a good, but the Russians are still battling for this village, and we've kind of talked over the purpose of trying to secure these gains before, so I won't repeat it here. But the Russians are still battling to secure these three villages, or at least Stimatovka, because then that's the final nail in the coffin. We have not gotten any changes in Pishana from last week. We talked about how the Russians reached the southern outskirts of Pishana, but the sources are still saying they're still battling at this village, but we have not gotten any changes from last week on that. Same thing with Stepova Novoselivka. Russians said they captured it, but we don't have any geolocated footage of anything happening there. One thing of note is that it seems like the Russians are now focusing on Sinkovka right here. It looks like they stopped in this direction because the Russians kept attacking it and kept getting, destroyed. It seems like the Russian commanders here were really ass, or the Ukrainian defenses were just too good. But it seems like now the Russians are trying to improve their positions and try to cut off Sinkovka. We have some footage showing that the Russians have taken this area, that the Russians had advanced on this area and advanced along this area. So the Russians are trying to improve from Velishnia and are trying to outflank Sinkovka from the east here. Because the Russians have always been on the northern outskirts of Sinkovka, but the Ukrainians could, support it from Kupiansk. But if the Russians could attack, say secure, are on this area, then it's going to be a lot easier to storm it from the east and from the north, and then force the Ukrainians back to Petropavlovka here. So it looks like the Russians are trying to start trying to outflank Sinkovka instead of attacking it head on. In the Kharkov direction, we have some changes. Actually some big changes. This was one of the biggest things that surprised me is that the Russians have made created a how do you say it, a foothold in the southern part of Vochansk, and we saw footage of the Ukrainians shelling Russian positions here. So it looks like the Russians have said they've created according to Syriac, this is the foothold. The exact dimensions of this foothold are up in the air, but almost all sources say the Russians have created a foothold in the southern part of Vochansk. If that is the case, Syriac says that the Ukrainians are still in this area. In fact, they said they recaptured this, but I doubt that. Like, if the Russians had this, let's say the Russians were still battling for this area, why would they cross the Vachachka River and create a very dangerous situation? I think that the Ukrainians are, they have this entire area under their control, and then also, sources say that the aggregate plant is also under Russian control. The only thing the Ukrainians have that is holding them on in the northern part of Vochansk is that they still control some parts of this Vochansk citadel, these high-rise buildings. But the Russians have already taken a few of them, and so now it's like battling for every single high-rise building. So in the Volchansk direction, the Ukrainians are it's actually kind of interesting that the Russians were able to regroup and actually create a bridgehead in the southern part, which is very, I thought they would not do that, but maybe they did a bold thing. Maybe they thought, hey, the Ukrainians are just going to continue sending troops to help reinforce the citadel. Well, what if we made like a bridgehead here and expanded it and started reaching this area and started flanking Vochansk in the south? Then the Ukrainians won't be able to put troops here anymore, and this will fall quicker. Maybe it was like a bold move, which is actually pretty interesting. That was a clever decision, but we shall see if they're able to hold this position, and not only that, expand it so that they could quickly capture the Vochansk citadel. Where the Ukrainians have progress is in the village of Globoka. We talked about last week, but the Ukrainians are still fully insecure of the northern part of Globoka in these farms, and and have basically cleared are able to outflank Globoka from the west here, and now from the north. However, direct attacks on the village itself by the Russians have been repulsed, and so the Russians are still in the center of Globoka, but the Ukrainians are managed to hold on to their gains, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians take Globoka. To be honest, if Globoka falls, then that kind of unhinges a lot of the Ukraine, because then why would the Russians keep their positions in these fields in the middle of these villages that literally don't make any sense? Globoka was something that held the Russian lines here, but with it falling, or with it almost if it falls, then the entire I would expect that the Russians might give up this entire Lipsy part of but they might keep their positions in the Vochansk direction. But we shall see how the Battle of Globoka goes. Maybe they managed to push the Ukrainians out of Globoka, or at least in the farms of it. But so far, the Russian positions in the Lipsy direction are a bit are worse for wear. And yeah, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to our channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. And comment your thoughts and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.